Joey Carr from Safer Renting in a moment, and Sam Thomas from Z2K about the subject of tonight. It's broad daylight outside. Tonight's webinar, which is what happens to rent rises under the Renters' Rights Act. This is one of the areas that has some of the biggest changes. Some of the changes aren't actually big in terms of the law, but some of them, but are big changes because of other things that are happening in the Act, namely abolishing Section 21. So that'll be, yeah, a lot of new things to get your head around as a renter. So really grateful to Joey and Sam for joining us for this. We'll have 10 minutes from each of them roughly. I'll say a little bit more about some of the stuff that we have done as Generation Rent. And we will be then doing a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, then please pop them in the Q&A, which you should be able to find on the More button at the bottom of the screen, if it doesn't appear to you at the moment. Yeah, I'll if it's all right, Joey, I'll hand over to you.
So can you see that on the full screen version?
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so my name is Joey Carr. I'm a project officer at a service called Safer Renting. And we're part of the charity Cambridge House, based in Southwark in London. We are a specialist service that provides support and advocacy for private tenants. So that's tenants not in social housing or housing association properties, particularly around illegal eviction and harassment. But in general, we seek to strengthen rights and access to justice for renters. In today's mini presentation, I will just be covering two major changes that were coming about as a result of the Renters' Rights Act on the 1st of May. So that's this Friday, actually. So the first is, how can your landlord increase the rent of assured tenants from the 1st of May, and how you can challenge a proposed rent increase under this new mechanism, or under this mechanism. So the mechanism we will talk about today, so the only way that landlords will be able to raise rent from the 1st of May onwards, applies to assured tenancies. And these are the most common tenancy types for private renters. However, if you live with your landlord, these may not apply to you. My advice would be, if you're not quite sure what type of tenancy you have, please Google Shelter's tenancy checker to find out what type of tenancy you have. But don't go necessarily by the name of the agreement that you have with your landlord, because that could be wrong, or it could be a sham agreement. So just to kind of to frame what I'm saying is, this applies to assured tenants. So please do check what type of tenancy you have, so you know whether this applies to you. So currently, for the rest of this week until Friday, your landlord has been able to increase your rent in 3 ways. So firstly will be mutual agreement between a landlord and a tenant. So that's when your landlord says, do you agree for your rent to go up? And you can say yes. Or they could ask if you were happy to sign a new agreement, and that would increase your rent. Or they could serve a valid Section 13 notice, and we'll go into what that might be in a minute. Or there could be a review clause in your tenancy agreement that might dictate how and when your rent increased. However, from the 1st of May, if you're an assured periodic tenant, your landlord will only be able to increase your rent by serving a Section 13 notice, and they can only do that once a year. So all of the other ways that a landlord could previously increase your rent will no longer be valid. So they can't just contact you and ask if you accept a rent increase. They cannot apply any clauses in any kind of agreement to increase your rent, and they can't ask you to sign a new tenancy agreement at a higher rent if you're already living in the property. The only time that you can agree a rent change will be if the landlord has already served a Section 13 notice and you're negotiating with them. So what is a Section 13 notice? So it is a rent increase notice on a prescribed form called Form 4A. So that form looks like this. It's 9 pages long, but these are 2 of the pages. This says do not use on here because it hasn't come into force yet. So this is not currently a form that a landlord could use, but from Friday they'll be able to. So if your landlord is increasing your rent after the 1st of May, they need to be sending you a form that looks like this, obviously with filled in with the right details. It will need to give you at least 2 months notice of a rent increase. So these can't be sudden. They'll always have to be a minimum of 2 months. And it can only be served once per year. So what are your options if your landlord gives you a Section 13 notice? So first, you can accept the rent increase and then just pay the rent increase and that's all done. Secondly, you can negotiate with your landlord. So if your landlord sends you a Section 13 notice, you can always contact them and just negotiate between yourselves about whether you might want to propose a lower rent than that if you can't afford it, or if you don't think that that's an appropriate rent for the property. Or finally, you can challenge the Section 13 notice at the first tier tribunal. And that is what we are going to be, that process is what we're going to go through now. So there are 2 ways. You can challenge a Section 13 notice for 2 reasons. Firstly, you can challenge the validity of the notice itself. So you can check the notice against your tenancy agreement, and you can look at the rules for whether or not it's valid. And if it's not valid, then the rent increase notice will have no effect and your rent won't go up. And you can refer this notice to the tribunal and ask them to decide whether or not it's valid. So we'll look at that first. And secondly, even if the notice is valid, you can still refer it to the tribunal and ask the tribunal to set a different rent if you think that rent that the landlord is asking for is higher than market rent for a similar property in your area. And we'll look at what that might mean shortly. So first, we'll look at the question of validity. So as we've seen, this here is the Section 13 rent increase notice. I can't show the whole thing for space, but it's got a lot of boxes that the landlord needs to fill in. And they need to do this correctly or the notice won't be valid. So firstly, is it on that prescribed form that I've just showed you, or a form substantially to the same effect in the same words? Are the dates on the form correct that the landlord's filled out? These are things you can be checking. So does it give at least 2 months notice? Has the landlord signed the form? And then there are more specific dates that the landlord needs to get right in order for it to be valid. So has it been at least 52 weeks since the tenancy began, because they can't increase it until a year has passed? And has it been at least 52 weeks since any previous rent increase took effect? Also, does the new rent rent they have proposed start on the same date as the beginning of a new period of the tenancy? So if we look at the increase here, at point 4.6, it says the new rent will start on. That date there will need to match the date that you pay rent on your tenancy, because the landlord can't increase the rent on a date that you're not paying rent. So if you look down the side of the rent increase notice here, you'll see lots of different notes to landlord and tenant. It's really important that you read this form thoroughly and read all of these notes because they will give you specific guidance about what the landlord needs to do for the form to be valid and what the tenant could do if they don't think it's valid. So a lot of the information you will need to establish whether the form is valid is on the form itself. So please take your time to read it when you get one of those. You should have at least 2 months to look at that. Importantly, please check the date that the new rent will start at paragraph 4.6, because if you do think about challenging the notice, you'll need to do it before the new rent takes effect. So if you do want to challenge the amount of rent, you can refer the notice to the tribunal. And that's if you think the rent, the new rent that the landlord is proposing is higher than the market rent in your area. So if you do send it to the tribunal, the tribunal will look at your property and the rent proposed and evidence about your property, and they can set a new rent for that property. And that new rent will either be the market rent for the property, or it will be the rent that the landlord's proposed, and they will always choose the lower of those two figures. So if they think the market rent is higher than what the landlord's asked for, they will set it at what the landlord's asked for. But if they look at it and they say, actually, the landlord is asking for rent that's higher than the market rent, they will reduce that and set it at a lower rent than what the landlord asked for. And it can be any amount lower than that. So what is the process for doing this? What do you need to do if you want to challenge it? So you need to find a form called Rents One form, which you can just find very easily by typing it into Google. And you can fill out this form online, or I think you can download it and email it to the tribunal. And you need to submit that form along with your tenancy agreement, if you've got one, a copy of the rent increase notice that the landlord sent you, and any evidence that the landlord has requested or that you think will be relevant to your case. And you need to do that, importantly, before the new rent takes effect. So if the landlord says the new rent's going to take effect on the 1st of December this year, you need to make sure you're sending that in. I think it's by 4 p.m. the day before. So don't leave it until the last second in case anything goes wrong. And then the tribunal might send you some directions after that. So please make sure you give them the right contact details so that you can comply with any of those and comply with them on time. Importantly, you can request an inspection by the tribunal. And that might be if you've got, particularly if you've got disrepair or a small property or anything wrong with the property that you might want the tribunal to look at. Because obviously any kind of like defect or anything around the property that you want to draw their attention to that might affect the market value of the property, sometimes it can be very effective to show that to them in person, and that won't cost you any extra for them to come and look at the property before they make their determination. Then you can ask the tribunal for a hearing, and both you or the landlord can ask for that if you feel like there's evidence you want to present to them at a hearing. And there will be a fee to pay of £47. So you can apply for help with fees to mean that you won't have to pay that fee. And you can apply for that if you are receiving benefits or if you're on low income. So please do check into that because it may be that you don't have to pay a fee at all. So what are some tips for making a referral to the tribunal? Always ask for a property inspection, especially if you've got any disrepair, so the tribunal can see that firsthand. If you've got any disrepair, please provide evidence of that, so the tribunal is made aware of it, even if you're also going to ask them to inspect the property. If you've made any improvements to the property, please provide evidence of that because the tribunal can't take into account any improvements that you've made when they're looking at the market value. Reference local housing allowance if it's lower than what the landlord's asking for. It's not the same thing as market rent, but they might be able to take it into account if what the landlord is asking for is significantly higher than local housing allowance. That may be a helpful factor to draw to their attention. If you've got any very weird terms in your tenancy agreement, for instance, that are negative, draw those to the tribunal's attention, because obviously if you've got onerous terms that like you're not allowed to have guests or something like that, the landlord's attempting to impose upon you, even if you don't believe those terms are valid, you should raise those with the tribunal, because obviously that would decrease the market value of a property if there's lots of restrictions on or weird things that the tenant needs to the landlord's trying to impose on the tenant. If you've got an energy performance certificate that has a low rating, show that so they know they're aware of that. If you haven't had gas safety certificates or electrical safety certificates, mention that as well, because that would reduce the value. And anything else that devalues the value of the property, you want to be drawing that to the attention of the tribunal. The tribunal will then make a decision, as we've said, and they'll set a new rent for your tenancy, so that that new rent will then apply going forward. And as we've said, the new rent will be the lower of either what the landlord's asked for or what the tribunal decides the property's worth on the open market. And usually that new rent will have to be paid from the date of the tribunal's decision. It will apply going forward after the tribunal has made their decision about it. If the increase will cause you money problems, please ensure you draw that to the tribunal's attention, because they do have the power to defer rent increases by a further 2 months after their decision. So please submit evidence of undue hardship rather than just saying, I can't afford it. If it's more than you can afford on your income or benefits, please submit financial evidence in support of that. So just to quickly go over, what is the tribunal looking at when it's looking to determine what the open market rent is? And I think Sam's going to discuss this a bit with us now, so I won't go into this in much detail. But one of the things you can do is look for comparator properties in your area, and look for evidence on places like Zoopla, Rightmove, Facebook Marketplace, for properties that you think are similar but are a lower rent, so that you can show the tribunal that there are properties at a lower value being advertised that are similar. So therefore, that's showing that the market rent is lower than what the landlord is asking for. And yeah, draw attention to things like room size, location, if it's far from public transport, any features. So if you're comparing it to properties with a garden, for instance, that are more expensive and you don't have one, then that's an important thing to show to them so they can tell that your property is not as valuable as the ones you're comparing it to. So briefly, there are just some changes that could occur in this process. One is that a filtering mechanism could be introduced, which might change the process slightly that we've discussed today. So please keep an eye on Shelter's website, which will have really good advice about how to challenge rent increases in case there are any changes. And there is also a possibility that the government can change this process so that rent increases could be backdated to the date on your Section 13 notice. So as we've discussed, at the moment, when a tribunal makes a decision, the new rent will apply from the date of that decision, but it's possible that they could change that. I think particularly if the tribunal gets overloaded, so the rent increase could be backdated to the date that your landlord has said that the increase will start on the form. So that could potentially be a risk for some people who are concerned about being thrown into rent arrears. So it's always good to check that before you challenge. So what are the reasons to challenge? According to Marks Out of Tenancy, tenants currently have a 68.7% success rate when they challenge that increase and achieve a mean reduction of 14.6%. And as we've discussed, there are 3 really good reasons to challenge it now that the law has changed. So the tribunal cannot increase your rent above what the landlord has asked for. So it's a kind of a no risk a gamble from that perspective. The tribunal can only bring it down from what the landlord has asked for. Um, Unlike before, the landlord cannot serve you with a Section 21 notice for challenging a rent increase. Before, Section 13s have existed for a long time, but previously, if you tried to challenge them, often a landlord would just serve a Section 21, so people didn't have the ability to challenge it. That is no longer possible because Section 21s have been abolished. And obviously, the rent increase will also be delayed until the tribunal has made a decision. So that delay may give you a chance to adjust your finances or make arrangements to pay any higher rents once they do, if it does take effect later on. And also, you can ask for it to delay by 2 months more if you would suffer hardship. So you can both bring the amount of the proposed rent increase down. You can also delay it. Finally, you can appeal a tribunal decision, but you only have 14 days from the date of the decision to request written reasons. So please make sure that you act promptly if you do think you might want to appeal it. And also, you can also apply to the tribunal to challenge the amount of rent payable under a tenancy in the first 6 months after you move in. So you don't necessarily even have to wait for a Section 13 notice to challenge your rent. If you move into a property and you think that rent is too high for the market rent in the area, you can submit a challenge just to the tribunal straight away, but it has to be in the first 6 months of your tenancy. Thank you. I haven't gone on over my 10 minutes. I'll just stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Joey. That was really clear and really comprehensive. Thanks very much. And yeah, thanks for mentioning the first 6 months point as well, which is really not very well known at all. But that could be quite important, especially I think if if you move into a home and there's something wrong with it. It's one way of making sure you're not being ripped off. Great. Well, I'll pass over to Sam now, who will take us through some of the work that he and colleagues have been doing at Z2K, looking at what actually happens at the tribunal.
Thanks very much, Dan. Bear with me for a moment. I'm just going to share my screen. Great. Okay. Just brilliant. Hopefully everyone can see that okay.
That was great. Thanks.
Great. So yeah, hi everyone. So my name's Sam. I'm the senior policy advisor at Z2K. Z2K is an anti-poverty charity, and we work. We provide kind of specialist advice and representation for people living on low incomes, and we also do research and campaigning to bring about change. And our work focuses on social security and housing. So for the kind of presentation today, I'm just going to sort of dig a little bit deeper into some of the stuff that that Joey was talking about around what does market rent mean? And how does this tribunal process make decisions, and what does that mean for renters who are thinking about potentially using it, or who are thinking about negotiating a rent increase with a landlord and trying to think about what kind of leverage you have. And I should just say as well, so Z2K is going to be launching later this week a piece of research that we've done on the tribunal process, the kind of existing tribunal process. Just to try and get a sense of like how that's working at the moment. And we've got some kind of takeaways in there for the government and for policymakers, but also for renters who might be thinking about using the process. And I'll talk a little bit about some of that throughout the presentation. So I think the first thing to sort of talk about here, and Joey highlighted this really well. So the legal test that the tribunal uses is market rent, right? So what that means is essentially your landlord is not allowed to raise your rent above market levels. That's what that means. Now you might think, and indeed, like we and other organizations in the Renters Reform Coalition made this point during the Renters' Rights Act process. You might think that in many ways that's not very helpful, because the affordability crisis in the private rented sector is such that market levels often are the problem. Market rent often is the problem. It's not that rent tenancies can be unaffordable simply because the general rents in the area are so unaffordable. But I suppose I just wanted to sort of, I guess, caveat that a bit. So I've got this kind of legal test here from the Housing Act 1988, which says that defines market rent as the rent at which the dwelling house concerned might reasonably be expected to be let in the open market. Um, and I suppose I just wanted to just make one point about that, which is that landlords very often overestimate the market value of their properties. Okay, so we just heard from Joey that around 70% of cases that renters bring are successful. So just trying to unpack a bit what that means. It basically means that actually, these like unreasonable above market rate increases are quite common. In fact, they're accounting for the majority of cases. And I think a kind of dynamic that is quite common as a renter is that you maybe would just sort of assume that your landlord has a better understanding of what kind of reasonable market rent they'd be able to get for their property. But actually, the evidence shows that that's often not the case, and that very often landlords, either deliberately in the case of perhaps like a more unscrupulous landlord, or perfectly, inadvertently and innocently, overvalue their properties and therefore are open to kind of being challenged on it. Um, and so again, and just to sort of drill down onto this a bit, I think again another reason why the test that the tribunal uses to determine rent levels is more favorable than you might immediately think upon hearing market rents is that it's actually a sort of two-stage process that takes into account the specific condition of the property. So you might assume. So I think when most people hear market rent, you think the benchmark is market rent. What you might think is, well, that just means that all that's required is just having a look on seeing what other properties. So let's say you live in a two-bed, you're renting a two-bed property in the London Borough of Lewisham, right? So all that means is that we just need to look at what are the kind of going rents in the area that you live in. Like, let's have a look at what they are. And okay, a two-bed in that area broadly will get you it's this much a month. So that's the market rent. But that's not fully how the process works. So that's step one of the process. But then step two of the process is that the tribunal considers the specific condition of that property, right? So there's a sort of step one is sort of setting this kind of generic baseline market rent of like, okay, this is broadly what this kind of property would get in this area. But then stage two is kind of drilling down into that and looking at the sort of specific aspects of the property. Um, and so and I guess like one of the things that we've kind of like been found in our research is that often deductions can be applied due to condition for sort of reasons that you might not expect. So the most obvious example would be something like disrepair, so like quite serious disrepair. And that is something that you see relatively commonly. So it's not uncommon for the tribunal to make deductions of around 40 or 50% for cases of really severe disrepair. Talking about things like really severe damp and mold, or there have been cases where central heating is not working. So in those sort of cases, you'd expect to see really substantial deductions from the market rent. But actually, what was something maybe I just wanted to highlight was that often the kind of things that you can get a deduction for, it might be the less obvious things. It might be things that don't seem terribly dramatic compared to something like not having working central heating. So as Joey was saying, poor energy efficiency. So that's why it's always a really good idea to make sure that you've providing your checking your EPC. If the property has a poor energy efficiency, that's the kind of thing where the tribunal would be making some deductions, and even things that aren't necessarily related to sort of like the sort of disrepair of the property. So it's relatively common that you will see the tribunal make deductions because the sort of furniture or appliances that are provided with the property are kind of out of date, or that the property probably needs refurbishing but hasn't really been looked at in like a couple of decades or whatever. Things like that will get small deductions. Similarly, things like not providing white goods, not providing curtains, and the tenant has to install that themselves. Those are the kind of things that the tribunal will take into account. and then also, and Joey could touch on this as well. Even kind of like slightly outside of the box things that aren't strictly related to the property itself, but more to the terms of the tenancy. So you will see when we were kind of doing this analysis of published tribunal decisions, you would occasionally see cases where the tribunal had, the tenant had some slightly odd restrictive term in their tenancy about, restricted use of the outdoor space or something, or like quite particular requirements. And because of that, and because those tenancy terms were quite unusual, the tribunal took steps to reduce the rent as a result. Yeah. So I just wanted to then just to kind of emphasize this. I've got a couple of slides about with case studies about how the system can work in practice. And so these are both published tribunal decisions that are available on the gov.uk website. If anyone's interested to kind of see more about how the system works in practice, you can have a look at the all of the residential property tribunal decisions are published on the gov.uk website, so you can have a look. So yeah, so the first case study is just someone. So this is a couple that were renting a flat in Birmingham for £725 a month, and then the landlord sought to increase the rent to £1,325 a month. So that was a huge. That's like nearly a 50% increase, right? That's a really really significant increase. Going to be really difficult to afford that. So the couple applied to the tribunal to challenge the increase. So the tribunal essentially disagreed with the landlord's proposed increase on two grounds. So the first ground was that they found that a similar property in the area was actually only £1,000 a month. So the landlord had quite significantly overvalued, even on a sort of like generic level, how much that sort of property would get in that kind of area, right? Um, and then they made further deductions. So they found that should only be £1,000 a month, which is already a huge deduction from a huge reduction from what the landlord was originally seeking. They then made a further deduction of £125 a month, because of the condition of the property, because the condition of the property was subpar. So that then reduced the rent increase to only £875 a month. So it's still a rent increase, and it's still £150 a month higher. So that's, especially if you're on a low income, that's still going to be a significant jump. But you can see that's made a huge difference. And that's going to be, for those tenants, it's a saving of nearly £500 a month than if they hadn't challenged the increase. So that's really significant. And then yeah, here we've got another case study here. And this is something else. I mean, this is rare. I will caveat this by saying that this only happens in about 5% of situations, in 5% of cases. But there is quite an interesting trend of cases where the tribunal not only sets the rent below the proposed level of increase sought by the landlord, but they actually set it below the rent that the renter was originally paying before the increase was even applied for. So in this case, a woman was renting a flat in Bristol for £1,100 a month. And then the landlord tried to increase it by £300 a month to 1,400. But then when the woman applied to the tribunal inspected the property, found that it was in really, really bad condition, so extensive damp and mold, leaks, the kind of damage from a flood that had happened to the property. So it therefore, even though the actual market rent was originally set quite high, they made quite substantial deductions to it. And so they reduced it to £800 a month. So that's not only below the level that the landlord was trying to increase it to, it's actually below it's £300 a month less than what she was originally paying. So she's not only avoided an increase through going to this process, she's actually actively reduced her current rent by £300 a month. So I caveat that by saying that is relatively rare. So don't go expecting that outcome, but it can happen. Um, and yeah, and just wanted to sort of end by briefly touching on this issue of hardship, which Joey kind of covered as well. So I think something that you kind of see quite often in these tribunal decisions is that often for very understandable reasons, renters who use the process and don't understand the market rent test will, as part of their submissions to the tribunal, talk about the impact that the rent increase is having on them, is financially having on them. And and the tribunal in its reasons explains that that isn't relevant. So for when they're actually determining the actual rent level, the hardship or affordability concerns of a tenant are not relevant, right? But where they are relevant is in this question of undue hardship. So the tribunal can delay increases, even in the case of hardship, but it's only going to be for a maximum of 2 months though. So as Jerry was saying, it's always worth highlighting any kind of affordability concerns as specifically as you can, because it seems like the tribunal isn't very good at kind of probing that. So it's really good to, if you're trying to get a hardship delay, you should make that really clear. You might even want to use language like undue hardship when you're challenging your rent increase, just to make it really clear that that's sort of what you're pursuing. Um, and just sort of related to this, I guess I just wanted to make a kind of further point around the fee and how that affects the decision about whether or not to use the tribunal. So as Jerry was saying, there's obviously if you're on benefits, or if you're on a low income, you've got a good chance that you're going to be able to get a full fee remission. Um, and even if you're on a higher income, you might be able to get a part discount on the fee. But I suppose the point I want to make is even if you don't qualify for a discount on the fee, you will probably still be better off challenging your rent increase, even if you don't win your case, because because simply by the act of challenging the increase, it delays the increase, and in most cases, the delaying the increase is going to outweigh any potential fee that you pay. That's sort of really important to bear in mind is although like psychologically the idea of paying a fee, nearly £50 for a process that you don't necessarily know what the outcome is going to be might feel a bit intimidating or might feel a bit risky, might put you off. In the vast majority of cases, you're actually going to be better off challenging your increase, because just by the act of challenging the increase, it delays it until the tribunal decision. And our research has found that the sort of average delay at the moment in the system at the moment is about 3.5 months from the point where the landlord serves the Section 13 notice up until the tribunal's decision. So that may change, and the government has invested more resources in the tribunal, to make sure that to try and make sure the tribunal isn't overwhelmed. And as Jerry was saying, they have retained the power to bring essentially change the delaying effect of challenging an increase. But for the time being and for the foreseeable future, that will be the case. So important to kind of weigh that up when you're making the decision about whether or not to challenge an increase. Um, so just to quickly recap, so key takeaways for anyone who's in a situation where you're thinking about challenging a rent increase. The first thing is, so landlords often overestimate the market value of their properties. So just because your landlord or your letting agent is very confidently telling you we could get this much on the market and we're just bringing it up to market rate, that might not be true, right? So it's important to kind of like be critical about that. Secondly, is that renters can gain really significant financial benefits from challenging rent increases. So we saw that in those two examples, and our analysis has shown that the average renter who uses the process is over £1,000 better off per year as a result of using the process. So when you combine that with the strong success rate, that there's going to be a good chance of financial benefits from using the process, on average. And yeah, the third thing is that highlighting issues with condition is going to be really important to success. So you want to be making sure, if there are problems with the condition of your property, or even if there are things that are sort of subpar, generally, not necessarily like serious disrepair issues, you want to highlight that to the tribunal. As Joey was saying, you can request an inspection, but you can also provide photo evidence, other kind of documentary or email evidence, to show the tribunal any issues. And yeah, finally, you can get a short delay in the case of hardship, and also the act of applying itself will also delay the increase, which might outweigh the sort of cost of potential upfront cost of a fee. Yeah, brilliant. That's me all done. Thanks very much, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. That was really really excellent presentation, and yeah, thanks very much for sharing that. And I'm looking forward to seeing the research that comes out later in the week. We've got about a quarter of an hour left, and we've had quite a few questions. So if it's all right, I'll just start rattling through them. A couple a couple of people have asked about kind of what's happening now if a landlord's trying to raise the rent right now. Will it will the current law take precedence over the what's coming in on Friday? Um, and I guess, I mean, my instinct is that, I mean, and I should say that we can't provide individual advice as speakers here. We can only provide sort of general principles about what the how the law might affect you. But my instinct is that if you've not agreed a rent between now and the 1st of May, then the new system will come into force. Is that your understanding?
I think my understanding would be any rent increase notice issued before the 1st of May would the old rules would probably apply. So there are still
Yeah.
currently rules that would apply that Section 13s already exist. So if you've already received one, the process is incredibly similar. The
Yeah.
only difference is that the tribunal can backdate your increase to the date on your notice, and the tribunal can increase your rent above what the landlord has asked for. But apart from that, those are the two major differences. Apart from that, everything we've said is the same. And also, I think there would be no fee for challenging it.
Yeah.
But if your landlord hasn't actually issued a Section 13 notice yet, then you can still agree a new rent under one of those old processes I went through at the beginning until the 1st of May. But from the 1st of May, your landlord would only be able to use Section 13. So if you agree to something now, as Dan was saying, it won't be like invalidated on the 1st of May. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think that'll be right.
Great. And I suppose someone else has asked about um, uh, agreeing a rent within the last year, um, and whether that could be um, basically superseded by a new rent increase from the 1st of May. I mean, this particular question was about the rent staying the same. I know that Joey, you mentioned the 52-week rule, um, but is that only about a new rent being set, or is that a new agreed rent, or agreeing that the rent won't go up? Do you have have any thoughts on that? If a new tenancy's been, or if a tenancy's been renewed in the past few months, could the at the same rent, uh, could the landlord issue a Section 13 at the end of the
So
week?
stop me if you do you want to. Oh, Sam, I see you turned off your mic.
Oh yeah, yeah. Feel free to jump in there, Joey. So my understanding is that it probably wouldn't still be binding because I suppose the Act will outlaw any fixed term tenancy. So if you've signed a fixed term
Mm,
tenancy for like let's say the next 12 months at a set rent, then yeah, I'm not. I mean, it might be something that would need to be tested, but
yeah,
my instinct is that the landlord would still be able to increase using the Section 13 process. But whether or not they would do that is a different question.
what we might do, we're speaking to some civil servants tomorrow as part of a webinar. We won't get an answer from them tomorrow, but we could raise this question with them and see if we can get a decent answer for for today's attendees. Um, great. I another one. Someone asked about negotiation, and uh, the obviously the prospect of delays is has been talked about a lot, and obviously has prompted the government into introducing a fee. One thing I did read today was that the fee can be recovered. The tenant can recover the fee from the landlord if the rent decision by the tribunal is in their favour, which I presume means that the rent determined by the tribunal is less than what the landlord was asking for, which is interesting. I hadn't seen that until today, which was which is helpful. But I suppose another thing that I noticed on the, the government's guidance to landlords is that it is saying talk to your tenants before issuing a Section 13. So it's suggesting that the negotiation is still intended to be part of this process. Um, I guess we have a guide to negotiating on your rent on our website, which we'll be updating, and because obviously it'll be still potentially uh, 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 an element of the rent increase process. But the fact that if you agree a rent now with your landlord, you're avoiding a potentially long challenge, and that could be part of your bargaining position, I suppose. Be interested to know if either of you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, I think in general, like, in many cases, I think negotiating it's not necessarily about using the tribunal process every single time a rent increase is discussed. It's more that recognizing the enhanced power that the existence of this reform tribunal process gives you as a renter, and therefore the extra bargaining power that you can bring into, as you say, Dan, into your negotiation. So for lots of renters, um, yeah, realistically, negotiation is going to be the best way to resolve an increase. But when you have an obstinate landlord that really wants to impose an increase that you think is unacceptable, then the tribunal process is going to be a really important safeguard.
Yeah, I would second that because the landlord will, after the 1st of May, will have to serve a Section 13 in order to increase the rent. They won't be able to just negotiate informally because this will be the only mechanism. But you can negotiate and agree a lower rent than the one proposed in the agreement, and then and then record that, and then that would become your new rent. You don't actually have to go to the tribunal in order to ask them to set it. My one warning would be if you're negotiating, don't lose sight of the date that the new rent will come into effect under the Section 13, because if you negotiate for too long and you don't reach an agreement with your landlord, then you'll miss your opportunity to refer the Section 13 notice to the tribunal to challenge it. So always be aware of that date and refer it if need be. And then you can always, with the agreement of the landlord, withdraw something from the tribunal later on. But best to challenge before the deadline and then withdraw rather than to miss that deadline and then the new rent will apply. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. And, it occurs to me there's a couple of other things that we've included in our guidance in the past, which is which the tribunal definitely wouldn't take into account, but could be quite persuasive with your landlord. One of them is if you've been a reliable tenant paying your rent on time every month, that's one reason for your landlord to hold on to you as a tenant, and not go through the process of finding a new tenant, someone they don't yet know, they don't yet know how reliable they are compared to you. That's a potential bit of bargaining power that a renter has. And then also, a lot of the time we find that the letting agent is putting pressure on the landlord to raise the rent as well. How that might play out with the Section 13 system, it's hard to say, but it's always useful if you're hearing only stuff from your letting agent to try and contact your landlord as well, because very often the letting agent is trying to get a higher rent because they get a higher commission as a result. I'll still got a few more questions. I'll try and squeeze them all in. There was a question about Section 13 validity if the deposit isn't protected, which I don't think is the thing. It would still be the case that Section 13 is valid if your deposit isn't protected. But I suppose that's one thing you could raise in challenging the rent increase in the form to say this is this kind of behavior that my landlord is carrying out. And so you could potentially get a discount as a result of that. Um, there was a question about whether a hearing is worth pursuing as well as an inspection. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So generally, so the from the advisors that I've spoken to, and yeah, keen to hear your thoughts on this, Joey. But generally, no. I think the inspection is generally more so. So one of the things our analysis showed is that if you request an inspection, the chances of the tribunal making deductions on the grounds of property increase by about 20 percentage points. So generally the advice is to request an inspection. The hearing, so the vast majority of cases don't have a hearing. And in general, because the sort of decisive, the sort of decisive evidence is really like comparable rents in the area and kind of like objective evidence about the condition of the property. The sort of written and oral submissions generally have less weight placed on them. So yeah, my instinct would be don't worry about requesting a hearing. It's probably not going to be as critically important thing as the inspection.
Yeah,
Right, thanks.
that echoes advice that I've had from other advisors as well.
Great. There was a question about how a local area is defined. Um, are there any is there anything that you uh, have gleaned uh, from the tribunal cases that you've seen, Sam?
Yeah,
About
that's I think that's a really good question. I mean, I think the answer is it isn't really defined. Like so it's sort of the way that the process works at the moment is quite so that the tribunal members that are making the decision are they will be like surveyors and they will be like sort of experts on like property valuation. So they are using their like kind of professional judgment and discretion when they're valuing the property. So no, there's no real sort of legal definition of sort of local area. I mean, you will see occasionally the tribunal will refer to sort of like pretty close by properties and like neighboring streets and things like that. And usually if you're relying on things like yeah, like Rightmove or sort of like, online listing data, you'll usually, depending on the area, of course, but you'll usually be able to find listings in like pretty close proximity.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because it kind of draws attention to the kind of a good way to think about when you're looking at these comparators, how to compare them. So for instance, if your landlord has submitted lots of comparators that are right near a tube station, you could be arguing that actually your property isn't in that same area, even if it might be reasonably close by, because it's 15 minutes further walk away from a tube station. So you want to be thinking about those comparators and say, actually, what is the local area? Are the properties that the landlord has submitted as being similar to mine, or are these properties that I found that are a lower rent actually in the same area, or are they potentially in an area that might have more valuable renting in? So yeah, thinking about all those concepts and drawing attention to that in your evidence is a really good way to show the tribunal where you live and how that might be valued.
great. Thanks very much for that. And I'm afraid we are running out of time. And we have had a few more questions come in. So I'm sorry we haven't managed to cover them all on the call. But we'll do our best to pick them up and try and answer them, maybe in an email to attendees, once once we've had the chance to try and answer them. But I'm just going to share some final slide that we can with some information about how you can get in touch and stay in touch with Generation Rent. If you'll just bear with me. So thanks very much for joining this webinar. Should be appearing very shortly. Basically, if you're not already getting our emails, you can sign up to get emails on our website, the sign up page. We also have the link's not on here, but if you sign up for emails, you will get everything we have to share on our on the Renters' Rights Act as things come into force. We've obviously got more happening with the legislation in the in the for the rest of the year. We've got a database and so on coming into force. We're always keen to hear from renters about your experiences as a renter. So there's a link there to share your story. If you would like to have your say and get involved with our research, we have a renters panel, which will really encourage all renters to join. And then you can also become a member if you are able to spare a few pounds per month and support the work that we do. But that was our little blurb. I really appreciate also Sam from Z2K and Joey from Safer Renting taking part in this session and sharing their expertise, which has been fantastic and hopefully really valuable for everyone watching. As I say, we'll try and answer all the questions that we weren't able to via email, and this session will be available on YouTube as well if you missed any of it. So that's about it. Thanks very much, and we do have more events coming up later in the week. But thanks very much for being part of this, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.